In this video, I'm going to show you how I made this circle cutting jig for the router table. It's a great little jig and allows you to cut circles from 12 centimeters all the way up to 50 centimeters in diameter, although you can make this as big or as small as you need it to be. It works by pivoting on a pin, which is in the sliding carriage here. So you can adjust the carriage to the diameter that you need, drill a hole in the middle of the piece you want to cut into a circle, put the jig in place, and then the semicircular notch goes up against the flush cut or pattern router bit in the table, and then you can guide your piece through and end up with a perfect circle. This is the first video in two parts. This part I'm going to be going through how I built the jig itself with the pivot pin, and in the next video I'm going to be showing you how you can adapt this jig so that you can cut a circle on the router table without using the pin and the hole in the center of your piece. If you're new to the channel, please make sure you subscribe so that you don't miss the next video when it comes out. And let's get on with the build. I'm using an offcut of Beech for this project. I was initially going to use plywood, but I changed my mind as I wanted something a bit more durable. I ended up deciding on 30 centimeters long, 40 millimeters wide, and 25 millimeters deep for the dimensions. You could make this jig longer or shorter. All it'll impact is the maximum diameter of the circle that you're able to cut. Once I'd got everything marked out, I proceeded to cut the piece down on the miter saw and table saw. Once the piece was cut down to size, I bored out a 30mm hole in one end, and then cut across the centre of the hole to create a notch for the router bit to register against. I set up the router table with a 6mm straight cut bit. I then marked out 30mm from each end of the piece. Once I'd centered the piece against the bit, I added clamps to the table to act as stops so I could make repeatable cuts. With the back of the piece registered against one of the clamps, I could plunge it down onto the bit and then slowly move it across the cutting table to make the slot. I did this 3 or 4 times, raising the bit a few millimeters with each pass. then swapped the bit out for a 12mm straight cut bit so that I could start cutting the wider channel for the sliding carriage to sit in. Eagle-eyed viewers will spot that I have routed the larger channel on the wrong side. This was a mistake on my part, but luckily I was able to reset the fence and then recut the 6mm slot from the other side. I cleaned up the rough edges of the slot with a file, and then moved on to squaring up the carriage slot with a chisel. This isn't 100% necessary, but it will give you a bit more travel for the sliding carriage. Now that the carriage slot is all cleaned up, I cut an offcut down to size so that it would fit snugly within the carriage slot. I then drilled a 6mm countersunk hole to accept the M6 bolt, and then a 2mm hole for the pivot pin. I used a nail for the pin and cut it down to the correct length with a hacksaw. Once the pin was cut, I then sanded off the rough edges and gave the whole jig a good sand down. I could then assemble the sliding carriage. The bolt is simply screwed through the hole, and I secured the nail with a bit of hot glue in case I needed to remove it later on. The bolt is then secured to the jig with a washer and start knob, which enables the pivot pin to be clamped securely into position. Now onto the test. I marked out a centre point on a piece of scrap MDF and drilled out a hole for the pin to sit in. I could then remove the majority of the waste material with the bandsaw before cutting the circle on the router table. And that wraps it up for this video. I hope you've enjoyed watching. Please subscribe for part 2 and more weekly woodworking videos.